You're listening to DraftKings Network.
This is the Dan Batard Show with the Stugotz podcast.
Welcome to Meadowlarkers 87. I am Howard Bryant. Kate Fagan is with me here. Amin El-Hassan is not. But we do have the great Dr. Amy Bass, professor of Manhattanville College, author of, I'm going to get this wrong, I was going to say 3 books, but I think it's 4.
4.
I have 3 of them. I don't have the 4th one.
Okay.
Author of One Goal.
I'm on it.
Yes, not the triumph, but the struggle. The book I am currently reading right now. Those about him remain silent. All about the great Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, not far from here. The 4th I do not have, which I'm not grade grubbing. I'm just saying I don't have it. That's all. I'm not begging you for a free book. I'm just telling you I don't have it, which is In the Game.
Wow, that's a tough one to come by.
We've got Dr. Bass with us here, and we're going to talk about many things. But before we do that, we've got 2 pieces of business that we should talk about. The first one is that the great run of Meadowlarkers is running its course. We are going down. We've got 3 or 4 more episodes before we sail off into the sunset. So we'll be either at Meadowlarkers 90 or 91, depending on whatever these things depend upon.
What's happening in the world, yes.
We are going to be doing other things, but it has been a terrific, terrific time. But we still have more to do. 4 episodes left, I believe. The second order of business is, of course, our honorary captains. Kate Fagan was not with us last week for Meadowlarkers 86. We only did 1 captain last week, and that was 1986, the year I graduated from high school. And our captain was Matt Murdock, otherwise known as the alter ego of Daredevil, Man Without Fear, because it was the year that Daredevil 233, the great epic Born Again saga, came out. And of course, we had the Marvel Cinematic University pod on. So we did nothing but Marvel. We did nothing but comics. That did not mean we were slighting your number 86, New York Giants, Mark Bavaro.
Thank you.
Kate Fagan.
Okay. A week late.
Just so you know, it wasn't in purpose.
But I've been waiting 86 weeks for this honorary captain. Amy, Howard can pull everybody's jersey number who's ever played sports at any level, high school or above. And I have like 2 that I know. Patrick Ewing, 33, Mark Bavaro, 86. And now that I'm saying it, there's like a 3% chance Mark Bavaro wasn't 86, Howard.
No, he was not 86.
Yeah, he was.
No, Mark Bavaro was 89. Bavaro was 89. Lionel Manuel was 86 for the New York Giants.
All right, I'm not even going to look it up because I know you're right.
My goodness, Kate, you actually messed it. Bavaro was 89.
He was 89.
Yeah.
I still got time then.
Exactly.
Amy, don't worry. We do talk about things too. But yes, all right.
And to be very quick, we will go with our honorary captains for 87. 87, obviously, you can go with 87. Let's go first with the late, great Sean Dawkins, wide receiver from Cal, Baltimore, Indianapolis Colts, who just passed away last week. Very sad. We also have 87, Oakland Raiders, Dave Casper, the great Dave Casper. 87, you can go Robert Brooks, Green Bay Packers. But of course, there really is only one 87 if we're talking sports, and it is Sid the Kid, Sidney Crosby, Pittsburgh Penguins. So it's got to be 87. He is our captain for today. But we are here to talk about World Cup. We've got our championship. We have got England defeating Australia in one semi. We've got Spain defeating Sweden in the other. So we have England and Spain for, as we say in Boston, all the marbles. And a lot more. We really want to talk, to me, I really wanted to go women's the national team. Really wanted to go there first more than anything else for a couple of reasons. One, always fascinated by the aftermath of when championship teams do not win the championship for once and what happens after that, but especially when it comes to this particular team because of the transition that they've been through and also the politics surrounding it, the fraying that was happening behind closed doors, and then also, of course, if you follow Amy Bass's Facebook page, the amount of response from people who and I know and the American people know have not watched a goddamn bit of soccer for the last, however, 15 or 20 years, but had so very much to say about this defeat. A lot of places to go. Amy, welcome. Let me throw the first thing out at you. Could you just give us a bit of your Australia World Cup experience? And we also didn't mention your CNN coverage on this as well. But it seemed like you had quite a time in navigating both what was happening on the field and the responses that you were getting.
Yeah, I'm still happy to be sort of shocked when I find out that, oh, people hate the U.S. women's national team. I'm shocked. How can you not be, so proud and in love with the women's national team? I had the same sort of reaction when Brittany Griner came home. And I was like, I thought everyone would be happy. And I guess I'm happy to be a human being who was surprised that there were people who were like, let her rot in jail. She deserves this. So it took me by surprise, and it shouldn't. And I'm okay being surprised by it, because I think, good people are surprised when stupid things happen, like the reaction to the U.S. women's national team losing. The only time these people care, you said about soccer, Howard, I'm going to say about women's sports, right? We suddenly have these, with the trans issues in the last couple of years, we have these rabid protectors of women's sports who have never thought twice
Save our girls
about women's sports, right? Yes, like we're protecting our girls. You've never done anything to protect girls before. And now suddenly we have all of these, they deserve to lose. This is where wokeness will get you. And it's not the first time we've seen this. 2018, when Lindsey Vonn said, I'm not going to the White House, she gave that interview to CNN, I think in December. So just, weeks before the game. And then she had that training run back tweak. And everyone was like, this is God, right? Telling Lindsey Vonn that she should have said she was going to go to the White House. Good. I hope she breaks her back. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, Team USA. And I had one commenter back in 2018 in terms of Lindsey Vonn who said that the USOC should have like a vetting, right, to make sure that only patriots get to be on the team. So I think, it was the reaction to my piece about expectations versus belief, that, we can believe that they will win, but we shouldn't ever expect someone to win. That's not the way sport works. I think that speaks volumes to the fact that, people don't always act in sort of rational ways that progress in rational ways. You say you're a patriot, but you're against people who want equity. You say you're a patriot, but you're, cheering the loss of a national team wearing red, white, and blue. So that's the turmoil that always comes in the wake of opining about these things. And I guess I'm still happy that I'm still surprised by it.
I think it's been really a fascinating watch, this World Cup, for me, because everything has been flipped on its head in the world of women's sports. Or if you're looking at women's soccer, we have for so long had been living in this world where the Women's World Cup was a pretty big deal domestically to us, generally speaking. I mean, obviously it's grown, and there are still so many fights that the U.S. women's national team has had to take on, but it was pretty much a given we were getting to a certain stage of the World Cup, and the U.S. had like landed on a certain level, and the rest of the world, and we can talk, we've talked on this podcast previously about like all the reasons why that is, whether it's Title IX to the 99ers, and then to watch this World Cup and feel like not only because of the time difference, did it feel like a very quiet World Cup in some ways in the U.S., louder in ways we can get to when it comes to the way people have reacted to this team's loss, but quiet domestically. And then, Amy, I know you were in Australia, right?
I was not at this one.
But other reporters who we talked to, whether they're in New Zealand and Australia, and I'm sort of like floating this concept of like, seems like a pretty wild, like a quiet World Cup, doesn't it? And they're like, wait, that is the most American thing you could possibly be saying right now, because New Zealand was lit up about it. And then in the last couple of weeks, what's been happening in Australia, and then now to go into this final with Spain and England, two countries who are also going to be crucial if the women's game is going to grow at the club level, and the things we have seen in the Spanish league and the crowds that like Barcelona has drawn in various places, and the crowds in the EPL.
And Sweden thought they were destined.
Yes,
and Sweden was totally hyped about this.
And so we've got like the rest of the world is now on fire for women's soccer. And the US is in this like really awkward spot now.
Yeah.
Awkward in so many ways.
When you think about 2019, right? Not even going back to like the 99ers. 2019, the US comes out swinging against Thailand. And they're not good sports. They're terrible. Yeah. They scored too much. And then you fast forward to the Vietnam game, and it's like they don't score enough anymore. And it was like women can't win even when they win. No. Women can't win even when they lose. So it's just that, that opening group stage, the difference of the dialogue between 2019 and 2023 should have been, I guess, within my own head, a bigger wake-up call that this dialogue was not going to go the way that I thought it was going to go.
I think we should tear this apart a little bit and think about, I do think we may be talking about two different things, and maybe they're the same thing, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. We started this conversation, Amy, with essentially the culture war. Essentially that what we have here is you have a group of people, and let's just face it, Megan Rapinoe is the lightning rod. In any other situation, every single game or every single day of the tournament, there would be some sort of feeling about your star athlete saying goodbye. This is her last one. And it certainly did not feel like a farewell. It certainly did not feel like something that was going to be, that there was any pageantry to it, like there should have been. Considering the last in 2019, the Rapinoe pose after her goals, the guys were mimicking that as well. It was like the visual moment for the United States. And so there's always something a bit off about this. And there is sort of a revenge factor in terms of the response. And Kate, you talk about this a lot in terms of the way that the mainstream culture sort of laying in wait for the comeuppance. And it's been really, really hard to get at the women here because they always win. How long do you think this has been? Is it really since maybe a 2016 thing, or is it, when you start talking about that sort of tearing apart on the culture war side of this? Do you really feel like this was I don't know. I mean, you always know when Donald Trump gets involved, it's always going to be polarizing anyway, right? But the waiting for this team to lose type of thing was really sort of jarring.
But he did get involved in 2019, right? He called her out. She said she wasn't going to the White House.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
He called her out. They had he was still allowed to be on Twitter then. And she got under his skin and she was on fire, right? 2019 Megan Rapinoe, couldn't, she was a goddess.
Couldn't lose. Exactly.
Her Herculean, celebration pose. Little boys are doing it on the soccer field, which for some reason always seems to be our marker of like the women have made it because little boys are idolizing them. So yeah, that's 4 years in the making for him to be able to finally launch on Truth Social or whatever it's called, his launch about, woke Rapinoe, finally bringing this team down. And yes, she missed a penalty. And, instead of just saying this is an athlete who hasn't missed a penalty since 2018, of course he was going to put her in there to do this. We're just talking about exactly what you're saying, that the spark was finally kindled and the loss was a gateway. It was a gateway into a hellmouth.
Yeah. But there was a lot of, Amy, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, same Howard, like that. There's like a number of pieces to this, where this U.S. women's national team has found itself after this World Cup. There's a lot of people that, even though we supposedly celebrate in America, people fighting for what they think they're worth, there's a lot of people who were pissed, separate from the Trump thing, but pissed that the women got equal pay with the U.S. men's national team. Mm-hmm. They're just like angry about it, even though like that seems to be a pillar of American capitalism, is like fight for what you're worth, and whatever you can get, whatever the market will bear that you can get is what the market has told you you're worth. But there's a huge blowback, I think, to just the intricacies of what that pay structure is, and the headline just being like, right, woke culture, the women just pressured the U.S. national team until they got their equal pay, instead of like understanding some of the intricacies of it. And then and Howard, you and I were talking about this offline. Just if we're sticking on Megan Rapinoe, like there's also all of these layers of questions where it's like when you're making the roster for the U.S. national team, and the final roster, and how the U.S. women's national team and women's sports as a whole is so often can be hamstrung, for lack of a better word. But like, if you have people who are name recognition, they carry a lot of weight on how you're going to sell that team, how you're going to be able to like sell friendlies after the World Cup, who is on that team for media recognition. And Howard, you were even saying that like maybe I'm naive and thinking like this is still happening in men's sports, but like sometimes in women's sports it feels like it wasn't an equal playing field, right? There are players even historically in the U.S. women's national team. You can go back and you can see this pattern. Like the people who built the team, they always have that one World Cup where you're like, should they be on the team or shouldn't they be on the team? But you know, like,
yeah, exactly.
They're a builder of it, and like the name recognition lies with these group of people or like this handful of people. And so like the U.S. women's national team is always like, I've always seen it as like a canary in the coal mine, a harbinger. Like it's always dealing with the things that female athletes are going to deal with, like ahead of when other female athletes in other leagues deal with them.
Yeah, well, the one thing I was going to say about that, too, is that our good friend Dave Zirin over at The Nation had written about how, I think he had written something like, August 10th, why the right wanted the U.S. women's national team to lose. He says, conservatives want everything Megan Rapinoe represents: feminism, queerness, anti-racism, reproductive choice, women's strength to simply wither away. And that's a hell of a burden to carry underneath just being a great team. So like this is that sort of this is that culminating moment. And the point that you were making earlier, Kate, and I think we're just getting to this, is was this team even constructed as their best team? Like, do you need, because you still need those players to maintain that name recognition. So, it's like in other sports where, okay, you may want to retire Joe DiMaggio, but we still need you. You can't go just yet.
Well, and I think there's two layers to add to it before thinking about quality roster, bringing up all of the things that, the laundry list of the woke agenda that you're going to heap on the back of Megan Rapinoe. You're also talking about someone like Alex Morgan, who brought the receipts in the Paul Riley case, right? So there's been a lot of trauma outside of just what does Rapinoe and her bended knee, in solidarity with Kaepernick, which is years ago at this point. But the Paul Riley case came down, and it was Alex Morgan, right, who sells more jerseys at that point than anyone else playing soccer in the United States. Alex Morgan, who brought the receipts to bring Paul Riley down. And then you have the amicus brief that they signed, that they took part in, and the U.S. women's national team, they were not the only athletes who took part in the amicus brief leading to the Dobbs decision. But certainly Megan Rapinoe was one of the most vocal about signing on to that amicus brief and speaking about that amicus brief. And then when the Supreme Court decision, not the leak, but the actual decision came down, using a presser to cry and be thoroughly emotionally, just devastated by that decision. I mean, you want to talk about single issue voters in the MAGA world. Now you've got abortion on the table and health, reproductive rights and women's health. And where does Title IX figure into that? How are athletes, reproductive health is absolutely part of Title IX and the healthcare part of Title IX and what Title IX encompasses. So I think it's even hard to outline everything that this team was carrying in terms of those kinds of issues. It's an endless list.
It is. Never
mind, to circle back to what you just said, Kate, one of the sort of pithy things to say as they were heading towards that historic collective bargaining agreement was that the women made, the men made more to lose than the women make to win. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, right, that was one of the things that people who didn't want to get into the intricacies of that collective bargaining process and the court cases that were involved and what have you, that's what they like to say. So now what do we say that the women have lost?
Yeah, and let's also not forget internally, Carly Lloyd as a commentator.
Yeah, and not everyone agreed. Yeah,
exactly. And more of that got aired out as well. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I have to summarize what I think we've been saying these last few minutes is what I always think of when I watch female athletes as they are getting later in their careers. Like, it's the hidden cost of being a female athlete. When I'm watching the penalties against Sweden, and you see Kelly O'Hara miss, and you see Megan Rapinoe miss, like I'm not going to sit here and say like that's the weight of everything they've done, but like, did it cross my mind? that like these athletes who have been carrying like everything Amy has outlined over the last 10 years, for people to understand how much pressure has been on the shoulders of some of these women on the national team for like so many generations of World Cups and Olympics. Like, it's really hard to quantify. On one hand, you could say it weighs nothing, right? The game starts and it doesn't matter. But on the other hand, like, it's unfathomable what they have been carrying and doing. I mean, to illustrate this is like when they won the World Cup in 2019 and then COVID happened, a lot of people I knew around the team were like actually somewhat relieved that the Olympics were postponed a year because they just weren't ready, right? Like they had been that World Cup win was so big and there was like so little time to refocus for it. And so I feel like there has been something about this team that like the older generation has had to carry so much. And then you see these like young Trinity Rodman, Sophia Smith who like don't have that burden yet. And like, there's a freedom that I see them playing with. And it was juxtaposed with like, with some of like the veteran players and like the weighed down pressure of this past World Cup.
Well, can we also throw one other thing out here too, which I've always found sort of interesting, especially when you're talking about, and soccer is not a 4-year sport, but it always, when you're heavily weighted on World Cup and Olympics, it can feel like one, even though it's not. Megan Rapinoe's 38 years old.
Right.
Alex Morgan's 34 years old. I mean, isn't this also the shelf life of a professional athlete, no matter who you are? This is the transition year for this team.
Yeah. And
if you're looking at them, they went through all of the things, which is a good way to transition into the on-field stuff. This is what happens. They weren't going to play forever. Nobody plays forever. And to be perfectly honest, in watching their matches, and then you follow what was happening, were they that good this year? Were they, in addition to all of the other weight, at some point, it was like the time I was in, I remember I was in the clubhouse with the late, great Tony Phillips of the Oakland A's back in 1999, and they were playing, and they were really trying to get to the postseason, and they just ran out of time, and they just didn't quite get it together. And he was like, "No, man, you after all this is what we are." And after looking at the Portugal game, and after looking at Sweden and the Netherlands, they didn't score. Was it simply just the fact that this team had run its course?
I mean, look at the Wales send-off team. I thought was a big alarm. It obviously wasn't a full force kind of friendly, but that Wales game was terrible. And then you look at the drought, and I think, Kate, this is where I think we can say the burden isn't nothing when you hit the field. The lack of finishing, right? They dominated Sweden. That first half, I mean, my God, what time of day was it on the East Coast? It was brutal watching that game, but they dominated that first half. But soccer, this is why we love soccer. And I think this is why a lot of people don't understand soccer. You can dominate. You can have 9 times the number of shots on goal. But a hot goalie, which Sweden had, and as my dear high school, coach Mike McGraw always says, a hot goalie changes everything. And Sweden had a hot goalie that day. But the inability to finish, right? Watching Kelly and Megan shoot those balls into the sky, that's where I think you can say what is going on, that everything hits the post, everything gets saved, everything skies. That's where I think that little, that millimeter, which this game came down to a millimeter. The one person it didn't affect, luckily, was Alyssa Nair for the most part, who, we should name our children that for the next few years. But I do think that the finishing, right? Which, how many minutes did they go without scoring a goal? 207. It's the longest ever. It's the longest drought in World Cup history.
Yeah.
That's where I think we put these two things together, what happened on the field and what was going on off the field.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that when I saw the announcement about the Netflix doc, I gulped.
Yeah.
Like, I know it's ridiculous, but I was, Howard, you saw that Netflix bought a doc. They did a follow on this World Cup, the U.S. Women's National Team. And then in September, they're releasing, I'm sure, what they thought was going to be, and maybe it will still be incredibly interesting because of all of the behind the scenes, but was probably going to be more progressive throughout this tournament than it ended up being. But I say I gulped just because like, these hidden costs, and then you add another one on top of it. Just like this other, you're around sports long enough, and you're like, all the coaches, they have got all their superstitions, and they won't let you do this and they won't let you do that. And they're just so micromanaging every small little thing. And part of the legacy of this team and the greatness of this team has been everything they're able to do off the pitch. But there are times when you're like, well, how do you create a unified culture when this team has had to fragment itself in so many different ways to fight battles on a lot of different fronts? And then you put a roster together where your only objective is not the sole objective is not like, what is the best team? There are more objectives than that for the U.S. women's national team than just that, right? It's not one, it's not just the coach in isolation saying, what 23 players do I want? It's like the amount of variables that are being taken into account are like myriad. And it leads and Howard, I just find this fascinating, like this Megan Rapinoe question of like, if I'm her and I'm walking up to take that last penalty kick, there's like that gambler part of me that's like, well, if you stick at the table long enough, you're going to lose. And like, I just felt so deeply for her, because I was like, should she have been in the game in those last 30 minutes, right? Like, obviously she wanted to be, but I was like, I didn't know if it was the right decision for the team, and also like for Megan in the long run, as somebody who like then had to step up again and perform after having done so a dozen times in high pressure situations.
Yeah, when you're Megan Rapinoe, you got to be out there, right?
You want to be out there, but if you're me watching, you're like, oh.
Hey, it's Roy from the Dan Le Batard Show with Stugotz. US Cellular knows how important your kids' relationship with technology is, and they've made it their mission to help them establish good digital habits early on. That's why they've partnered with Screen Sanity, a nonprofit dedicated to helping kids navigate the digital landscape. And for a smarter start to the school year, US Cellular is offering a free basic phone on new eligible lines, providing an alternative to a smartphone for children. Start smarter with US Cellular. Visit uscellular.com/built-for-us to find out more. Terms apply.
On August 23rd, the summer event Ahsoka arrives on Disney+. Witness the thrilling adventure of former Jedi Knight Ahsoka Tano as she uncovers a disturbing new threat to the galaxy far, far away. Don't miss the 2-episode premiere event of the highly anticipated Star Wars series Ahsoka, streaming August 23rd, only on Disney+.
What stock did either of you take into the Carly Lloyd commentary? And I bring it up because she came back the other day and said, well, of course I stand by what I said. I was the only one brave enough to say it. So she is now vindicated. What were your thoughts about the commentary itself? And then also, that is another example of the sort of culture fragmenting while you're expected to win.
Yeah, the Carly Lloyd question is just like, okay, well, we can pull it apart as much as we can, because I do think, I think we'd all agree that part of what made the women's Final Four in basketball interesting was just people's opinions.
Yeah.
Water cooler.
Yeah. We've been saying for decades, like, what fuels sports and that women need it. And so like what comes in the door when you have that is like a bunch of shitty opinions too. I mean, that's just like, there's a lot of shitty opinions in men's sports. And so women's sports, like, we want all of the opinions. And yet there is still that kind of like protective mechanism that you can't, like, if you've been in the women's sports world, you can't help but be like, coming from inside the house sometimes, like a Carly Lloyd, where that there's different motivations beyond just trying to speak some sort of unvarnished truth.
I'm just keeping it real, Kate.
Who's keeping it real? I am, or Carly is?
Carly. I'm just keeping it real.
Right, exactly. Like, and I guess the keeping it real hidden behind like an agenda that gets your voice louder than other voices, like, it just becomes very, very complicated. Like, I want criticism of women's teams and female athletes, but like, you do know when you feel like those criticisms are coming from a place of like somewhat objectivity versus like a pursuit to establish yourself as like the contrarian voice to this team, and it feels a little contrived. And I think that's where we're,
especially if it's politically contrarian as well.
I don't know where you land on this, Amy.
I think unpacking it, into little tiny pieces is actually super useful. So I appreciate that, Kate. I think first of all, Carly's previous comments about some of the culture issues in this team and what she was and wasn't comfortable with lay a foundation that means we have to take that into consideration when considering what she said, right? I don't think she's ever called the team woke, but she has certainly talked about being uncomfortable with the statements and the politics that this team has evolved with. I think the second thing is some of it was just flat out hypocritical. When she sort of criticized Rapinoe and the retirement announcement, and this is Megan's last call. Carly Lloyd said goodbye longer than Derek Jeter did. It was ridiculous when Carly Lloyd retired. So I think there's some hypocrisy that has to be looked at. I think you do have to respect that Carly Lloyd is one of the greatest people to don a U.S. women's national team uniform. Her hat trick is legend. She's a great player and she has a lot to say about soccer. And there were some cohesion problems in those earlier games that weren't difficult to call out. So I can't give Carly Lloyd all that much credit for saying, they don't look cohesive. No one thought they looked cohesive. There was a lot of ugly soccer being played in the group stage. But I think that we also can't take Carly Lloyd out of the context in which she is giving these comments. She is sitting next to Alexi Lawless, whose entire mode of operation is to have people talk smack about him and pretend that he doesn't care. She is sitting in Fox, granted in a sport context, but I think that the very word Fox sports commentator Carly Lloyd, I think we can't get rid of all of that. And there were certainly some folks who went far in saying, is Fox Sports trying to become the Fox News of the sports world? And I think that's a fair question when you have Alexi and Carly saying some of the things that they were saying. I mean,
and is that why they're there?
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying is this is David Neal's last hurrah. Apparently, he's retiring after this World Cup. Did he put together this team? He talked extensively in the recent interview about why he wanted Carly in there and how he had to persuade her. But I think, do they want to become the Fox News of the sports world is a legit question. Does her commentary, play into that? Was it intentional in terms of playing into that? I'm fine to be in a space that asks that question. And I think that the response, again, Alexi had that one tweet that, launched 1,000 folks in response, including, some of my colleagues in the academic world, that, the only reason that you're tweeting that kind of garbage is to be the person that people love to hate.
Heel turn.
So that's, I think there's a bigger context outside of just who Carly Lloyd is and what she has said in the past. I think we have to look at the machine that is actually broadcasting these games and ask questions of that machine.
How difficult is it as a sports fan? Kate and I were talking about this offline, Amy, about how it's hard to be a woman, a fan of women's sports when it's not the same as just being a sports fan, because some of these sports are so well established that criticism is simply criticism. Whereas here, you're in hostile territory. So there are going to be some areas, Kate, where you want to criticize the game or criticize the team or criticize what you're watching, but you can't because of what your adversaries are going to do with that criticism. Suddenly it turns into, okay, you're not going to use my criticism to shit all over a game you don't even watch. So it makes it very difficult to simply, I can criticize the Celtics and how they played against the Heat. No one's going to say, oh, this is proof that the NBA shouldn't exist. You know what I mean? So how is it then there's a protective layer that you have to have, an advocacy layer that you have to have. Well, at the same time, we're still supposed to do a lot of journalism here too. So it puts the female game in a very different space in terms of critique.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, just like the U.S. women's national team that we're talking about has been. Because to your point, Howard, you hypothetically and 1,000 other people could take a bat to the foundation of the NBA, and you're like, no one's concerned that it's tumbling. Whereas, the U.S. women's national team is probably the representation of the strongest foundation we have for for a women's team in the U.S.
100%.
That I am pretty sure everybody who puts on this jersey will reach a level of financial and exposure that is unmatched across, except maybe the WTA, and that is just only a couple people.
Not a team sport.
Exactly. And so, but that doesn't mean that I don't think 1,000 people with bats or however many you extrapolate could shake the foundation of the U.S. It's not equivalent to the NBA in terms of generational inheritance and in terms of of the longevity of what they've built, like the roots so deep that let the masses at them and it's fine. I don't feel that way about it. I feel much more secure about the U.S. women's national team ability to maintain relevance and all of that than I do pretty much any other place. But as a journalist, I still feel like there's certain mantras that I'm absorbing about what my job is. And some of that is to speak truth to power about women's sports. And even on this podcast, I've caught myself being calling women's sports we, right? I'm sure I've done it more often than I thought I was doing it, and I try and rein it back. But I don't know how you approach it, Amy. I kind of bounce between, I guess I should try to separate myself, but then I don't know how these things grow if the people who understand them intricately don't write about them, speak about them.
Well, about the bad actors, Kate. It's like how I feel. For example, little secret, and we all know it, very rarely do Black journalists or Black commentators criticize other Black commentators. Why? Because we know what white people are going to do to it. We know how those comments are going to be distorted. So sometimes when you have something to say, you end up saying nothing. So you're not going to take my snippet and turn it against the game or turn it against the athletes or do something to it that was not the intention. It reminds me of when I was in Vancouver at the women's gold medal game between the United States and Canada in hockey. And both of those teams had been killing everybody by 10 goals. 15 goals, and then they played each other, and it was a classic. And so what does the head of the IOC say? Well, if these games aren't more competitive, maybe we shouldn't have the sport. I'm like, wait a minute.
Right.
The U.S. men's basketball team has destroyed every single team up until post-Dream Team. And nobody said that basketball shouldn't exist at the Olympic level.
Softball, same thing. It got thrown in with baseball, but just exactly that. I think the space that we're occupying is actually part of the story, which makes everything sort of tautological and self-fulfilling, and it makes your head hurt because part of the problem is exactly what you've articulated. And as we know, in terms of women and equity and the United States, it's not just in sport, right? This is in the office place, solidarity. You're not supposed to call out your rotten female colleague because you're both really lucky to be there. And I think that we see it when we have moments like Kim Eng, right, hitting to the front office. All right, we have the first. So many stories about firsts, which tend to be stories about firsts and onlys, right? And onlys aren't good because when that one goes away, you might be last.
First and last.
And Kate, you wrote about this so beautifully that, when do we get to tell the superhero stories about women in sports? Why are we so much of what we write about is the path breakers and the breakthroughs and the, finally won the right to do this and finally won the right to do that. It is still a story of struggle and contest. And Howard, you just made me think of I think it's Ralph Ellison who said, I can't be a reaction to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the space that you're looking at with female journalists writing about women's sports is that normalizing the critique, honestly, we're not there yet because of exactly what you're articulating. That piece is also part of the bigger picture. Just like, female coaches are still, oh my God, there's a female coach.
That's right.
Female broadcasters, oh my God, there's a female broadcaster.
Yeah, there's still an advocacy building piece of this.
Correct. And as long as the activist and advocacy piece is still there, it's beyond a rock and a hard place. It's just a hard place.
Yeah, I remember thinking about this when they lost, actually the game against the Netherlands. I remember talking to a friend of mine and I was like, they're just not that good. I'm like, this reminds me of the 2001 Yankee team I covered. They had won 3 straight World Series. You could see that that the thing was sort of declining. We knew that they were going to be in a transition year. They gave one last valiant classic World Series against the Diamondbacks, and they lost in a classic game. But this team was not afforded that sort of elegiac goodbye into that next phase because of all of this stuff. You really, in a lot of ways, this was a team that you probably should have celebrated win or lose for all they had done, right? Because when you are looking at the new players, whether it's Trinity Rodman or all of them, it's going to be a new team, in 2027, or it's going to be a new team.
But that thing, I think, when Messi and the U.S. women launched on the same night, right? So I wrote about it that night, and my end game was it actually doesn't matter what this U.S. women's national team does, because they should have nothing left to prove, and they should have no one left to answer to.
Exactly.
And then, oh my God, again, I was, shockingly wrong.
Yeah.
Because it turned out they have a lot left to prove, and they have a lot of people who they might not feel the need to answer to, but these are people who are demanding answers.
Yeah. Kate, go ahead.
Circling back around to, at the top, talking about how this World Cup's been flipped on its head and now kind of quiet domestically, you know what I'm saying? Quiet in terms of us watching it and chatting about it, not the U.S. women's national team, but around the world it's exploded, like to the point of what this U.S. women's national team has been about. There is a lot of that doesn't happen the way it's happened if not for the U.S. women's national team. And if not for a lot of the players who have gone to different countries and been a part of different, whether it's the Premier League or what they have done in terms of how they have fought for things here. I mean, they're not just the model for how a women's team can be supported here in the U.S., a team sport, but they're also like the reason that a lot of soccer has exploded across the world.
They are the dream team in a lot of ways. They're the equivalent of that in terms of growing the sport.
NCAA play.
Yeah.
How many people are playing in the NCAA from other countries?
And so it's just when you also like take that piece into account and then you see how this team has been treated, like any reasonable person should be thinking, what other variables are at play? I've got these players who have won 2 World Cups and Olympic gold medals. In any other context, they are given a swan song. And so what are the variables? I mean, and they're all of the ones that we've been talking about. Like, to me, that seems like a reasonable conclusion to come to when you look at what these players have done.
Yeah, Amy, you put up a note. I remember, I was just stalking your page one day, and there was, because the matches were overnight, and I will say I refer to the Australian Open as no sleep January because of the 14-hour time difference. I didn't make it through a lot of these, but I remember there was one I woke up to. Obviously, I missed the rest of the match, and you had a post and it said something like, "I don't want to hear that the rest of the world is catching up. No, no, no." What did you mean by that? Because I thought that's actually sort of a good thing in some ways. This is isn't it part of the ritual here that they are going to catch up if you have that much influence and people start. What did you mean by that?
My thought, and it was on no sleep. So I really appreciated the conversation that ensued. My thought is that it's not done yet, in that, yes, you look at the 12 teams that started the inaugural World Cup, and now we're up to a bracket that's 3 times the size. And none of these games were smashing blowouts. Although I have to say today, Australia-England was a different game than I thought we were going to see. But we didn't have the Thailand-US game of 2019. England, my gosh, right? In its group stage was barely squeaking by some of it. Was it England-Haiti was their first match? It was 1-0. I think the catching up thing is the idea that you have, Spain in the final with some of their best players still home, a controversial coach situation. You have Colombia, whose federation is a disaster for these women and these teams. Again, some of the best players left at home. You have Jamaica that had to crowdsource to even get there. You have the French hijab nightmare, which, the sort of, I had said the post-colonial gods had smiled down on this World Cup when you looked at who was facing who
was playing who
in
exactly.
these games. It was just crazy thinking about, you've got Morocco and France is, forbidding hijab in sport in other places. And that's a conversation to think of. So I think, there's so many of these stories that, catching up to what? Because it isn't just about the competitiveness. It's that bigger picture of federations paying their teams, federations,
yes.
Treating their players equitably, coaches having relationships that aren't abusive sexually or otherwise. It isn't just about the score. So, this is the sort of, historian in me that says we always have to look at this bigger picture. And the U.S. is just, a tiny little space away from this historic collective bargaining agreement, one that the Netherlands had years ago. And so what does catching up mean?
Yeah.
And so I would like us to just be a little bit more precise when we're sort of evaluating and assessing the state of global women's sport.
I actually thought it was really interesting from the standpoint that suddenly there's a lot of experts out there about a game you don't watch.
I mean, I was just going to add that, in some ways, the U.S. hasn't even, we haven't even lived up to the promise of what the U.S. women's national team. I mean, we are only a year removed from our own domestic league having the scandals and the types of behavior patterns that we have seen in other places all across women's sports across the world. I mean, so it's just seeing this U.S. women's national team and knowing the backdrop of what women have to do to play sport. And it's just bonkers.
Right. So catch up to what?
It's just bonkers.
Yeah, I took it literally. I just took it as on field.
Right. Now, and some people did, and some people, my English friends were all like, we've invested a ton of money. And it's great. But, there's still those federations out there who are saying, show us the results and then we'll fund you. And, that's the chicken and egg question. Do you wait for results to fund, or do you fund and support to get results? And one of the things, to just sort of bring it back to that thing you were talking about with the NBA, and, you can't take down the NBA, the public amnesia about the amount of support men's sports have received.
It's crazy.
For generations. We have obliterated that. The public funding in stadiums and teams. It's just, come on.
Not just that, Amy, and let's close this up with some final thoughts, but not just that, Amy, but, and Kate and I talked about this on the show many moons ago, let's not forget how many years it's taken. The National Basketball Association 40 years ago was on its last legs.
Correct.
They needed an influx. It's not a given. They were playing double headers in cities that didn't even have NBA teams to try to get people interested. Major League Baseball has been around since 1883. So when you're looking at this idea, whether it's women's basketball, whether it's soccer, whether it's any of it, this idea that you can, to your point, Amy, about the chapter being written, we're in the prologue in terms of looking at this, taking any sort of long view. But Kate Fagan, final thoughts on Meadowlarkers 87.
Yeah, I mean, not the Mark Bavaro episode that I thought we were going to have.
Soon to be.
No, I mean, you're using the book analogy, and there's a small part of me that's has the real book even started? Because it's everyone's just sandbags women's sports at every turn possible. Have we even had a stretch of time where it was funded and invested and supported beyond a blip here or there? I mean, it's just at times, I mean, I know we're already in the book, and I know this is just the way the book is going to be. It's going to be a rocky roller coaster of a book when it comes to women's sports, but we still haven't even gotten to a place where I can see any uninterrupted time where it hasn't just been people going out of their way to shit on women's sports. Going out of their way. It's just it's a never-ending story with women's sports.
Dr. Bass, last word.
Same and ditto. It's sort of like how I felt during this whole long 50th anniversary of Title IX piece, where everyone was like, what has it done? What has it done? What has it done? What has it done? And I thought, well, once it's fully enforced, let's assess it.
Right.
But we are so not even close. That assessing Title IX means you're assessing a work in progress. You're not assessing some finite thing. Whether we're talking about legislating justice, which is Title IX, or living justice, which is sort of this conversation that we've been having about the U.S. women's national team, it's a process, and I don't want to hear about progress.
Yeah. And by the way, it's done a lot.
Yeah.
Let's go back to 1972. It's done a lot. And once again, that's what I mean about the bad actors. I mean, one of the reasons why I make it a point to decide very, very succinctly, who am I talking to and do I feel like talking to you about this, because of the number of bad actors out there. But we've got two good actors here, Amy Bass, Kate Fagan. Thank you so much for this. We will be, what are we doing next week? We've got numbers to think about. We've got thoughts to think about.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a few more shows to do our best.
Maybe I can convince you to watch the Angel City doc, Howard. We'll see. We'll do a back-to-back.
Well, why would you need to convince me that?
I mean, I wouldn't have to convince you. It would just be like, let's do it. And you'd be in.
It's true. It is true.
All right.
All right. I'm Howard Bryant for Amy Bass, Kate Fagan, and the departed Amin El Hassan. This is Meadowlarkers 87. We will see you next week.